I'm here with Andrew Light, who is University Professor and Director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at George Mason University. He's also a Distinguished Senior Fellow in Climate Program at the World Resources Institute in Washington. From 2013 to 2016, he served as a Senior Advisor and India Counselor for the U.S. Special Envoy on Climate Change. And he has done extensive work on environmental ethics. You were also part of the conversations in Paris on climate change. And you have been a very prolific philosopher who really has taken philosophy into the public square, literally into Washington. And so I'm delightful that we are able to have a conversation about your experiences during the Paris Agreement talks, and the agreement that came out of that is really fascinating, and it presents a series of philosophical, ethical, and political challenge. But let me begin with a general question, a broad question, whether the Paris Agreement from this last December reveal or signal something about how we might have developed a global consensus on the science of climate change. That's the fact that we came together reveals something about scientific consensus on climate change.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Eduardo, for the invitation. It's great to be here at Penn State at the Rock Institute, a place that does incredible work as well in taking philosophy and ethics and putting it into the public sphere. So I would sort of say that the Paris Agreement does signal a bunch of things, and among them I do believe that it signals not only a broad consensus, though of course there are always going to be outliers, on the reality of climate change, that it's real, it's happening, it's caused by humans, it's happening faster than we thought it was. I think that one of the main drivers, in fact, of the success of the Paris Agreement, not the only one, but one of the main drivers was that we're seeing increasing impacts that are either can be attributed to climate change in a few cases, but moreover are certainly consistent with what the models have been telling us is kind of going to be, unfortunately, the new normal moving forward until we really succeed in our long-term mitigation goals. And I think that the sense in which we've seen many examples, Superstorm Sandy, the droughts in Syria, like other things, that are people are saying are sort of, this is climate change kind of happening now, was part of the impetus behind the urgency, I think, to get the agreement that we had in Paris. When the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the overall UN body, which Paris was like, one in a series of meetings that happen every year on, when that was originally created in 1992, climate change was really just a far-off problem. And so some of the delays, I think, in getting there were because of that. Again, there are folks who are going to sort of still say that there's something wrong with the science and such as that, but I think that even more importantly than the Framework Convention, the last report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the fifth assessment report, I think has just gotten to the point where we're really settling these things. There will be vocal outliers, but I think they're in the vast minority now.
Right. So it's not just the American scientific community, it's a global scientific community
Absolutely.
That has more or less come to a consensus that this is happening and it's getting worse. I wonder whether the targets, and perhaps you can give us some specifics about the targets that were agreed to in Paris, whether they reflect the scientific consensus, whether they're reasonable, or to what extent there's a disjoint between the target scientists have projected and those that politicians are willing to or can't aim for.
Yeah. So I think that the targets are much more ambitious than we thought they were going to be when we started this process of negotiating the Paris Climate Agreement, which was really a 4-year process, originally initiated and agreed to in 2011 when the Framework Convention Summit that year was in Durban, South Africa. The targets are just overall, they're not where we want them to be yet. They're not there yet. That's certainly true. But the best estimate is that if you add up all of the pledges that came in at Paris, and there were 188 pledges from countries that had been put on the table before we actually uttered the first word of negotiations in Paris, which was in itself quite an accomplishment. So that's 188 pledges, or as they were formally called in the process, intended nationally determined contributions. And those Paris pledges they covered countries that represented more than 95% of global emissions. So that's key. So that doesn't mean a 95% reduction in global emissions. That means that the countries that made pledges own, as it were, or produce 95% of emissions, which is a far greater participation rate we've seen in any other climate agreement. So that's what you need. You need those collection of countries committing to doing something. Now, you add up all of those pledges, and these are all pledges to, variously depending on the country, either 2025 or 2030. So a lot has to happen for those things to occur and get implemented. If everyone does what they say they're going to do, then you're looking at a long-term stabilization of somewhere around 2.7 degrees Celsius. The international standard up until Paris, the international target, was to stabilize at 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. We've already warmed the planet, humans have already warmed the planet 1 degree Celsius over pre-industrial levels, and we're already seeing a lot of impacts and forecasting many others, in the short term. And so we're very close. There is a signal in Paris to try to get it even further, to get it to 1.5 degrees. We don't know whether we're going to be even physically capable of doing that at this point, but there's work being done to try to figure this out. So 2.7 is much better than it was the picture before Paris. Now the good thing about this, though, is that the Paris Agreement, unlike previous climate agreements, isn't a sort of a one-shot deal where countries come in and they pledge, and then in 5 to 10 years we're stuck like renegotiating a whole new process. So what it does is it says every country that has joined the Paris Agreement, then beginning in 2025, you're going to have to start making your next cycle of pledges, with the expectation being that you can't backslide, that you've got to be very transparent in reporting your progress, and also that there will be an international process that will facilitate countries knowing where we are globally and also what are the opportunities, and it's called the global stocktake. So let's say, the first of those will happen in 2023. There will be a global stocktake on where we are on mitigation, adaptation, finance, everything, and then that will inform parties putting their next cycle of pledges in 2025. So the idea is that the pledges put forward in Paris are not enough. They're a huge step forward, I think, but you've got a process in the agreement that ratchets things up as we move forward. And then on top of that, I think, and we can talk about this more later if you want, there were many pledges separate from the Paris Climate Agreement that did happen, that were announced in Paris, about new cooperative programs to make it, for example, to do much more robust research and development on non-carbon energy sources in a collaborative way, with much more funding than we've ever seen before, that can hopefully improve that ability of countries to increase their ambition over time.
Right. It sounds like this agreement is unprecedented in the history of global politics, if you will, because you had nations committing ahead of the meeting. Mm-hmm. Then at the meeting, there were additional commitments.
Right.
And then you had people committing even above and beyond what they already agreed to.
Yes.
That is fascinating. How was that orchestrated? How was it that people came to the table with firm commitments and the willingness to commit beyond what they already brought to the table?
Well, that is exactly the right question to ask. Like, how do we do this? And I must say that everyone I worked with at the State Department was surprised at how much better the agreement was than what we thought it would be, and how much stronger the targets and the pledges were that eventually came out than what we thought they would be when we originally started working on this. So let's just take back the clock a little bit to 2009. So in 2009 was the last big, global climate meeting of the Framework Convention that got a lot of attention. That was, of course, the Copenhagen meeting, which is widely regarded as a failure. I have a different view on that. I think it was actually a very necessary first step along the road to Paris. But nonetheless, it was the first time we saw this new kind of architecture for a climate agreement, rather than having a bunch of countries get together and some subset of them have to go through a negotiating process where they set fairly common targets. It's called a top-down process. You negotiate the targets, and then countries who agree to then meet them by a certain date, or there are consequences. That's more or less follows many kind of approaches in diplomacy to try to set like a strong binding international treaty. In Copenhagen, this model was reversed, and we got something which really was sort of forecast where we'd get with the architecture for Paris. So in Copenhagen, parties were asked to put forward pledges. It was bottom up. Parties put forward their own pledges, what they're able and capable and willing to do by 2020. And then very much a big step forward, better rules about how we measure, report, and verify where countries are with respect to their emissions now and whether they are able to meet these targets they set for themselves. But it was done very bad. It was very slapdash. The biggest emitters didn't put down their targets until just like a few weeks, literally, before the Copenhagen meeting started, so there was no opportunity to look at what countries were doing. You know, parties were basically holding their cards behind their back, you know, so you couldn't really, there was no opportunity to push them to do more, to really adequately judge how robust their ambition was. And so we knew, but we knew we had something because you had like quite a lot of countries still willing to do that. So we had some 80 countries make these pledges, so you're getting much better buy-in than you got with the Kyoto Protocol. So the really part of the way of looking at Paris is, could we do what we did in Copenhagen but do it smarter and better? And so we started earlier. We decided in 2011 we're going to start this process to create this agreement by 2015, gave ourselves a deadline. And it may sound trite to people, but the goal was, let's create a race to the top. You know, race to the top is a much abused term in everything, universities everywhere, right? But really, it was literally that. Let's create a race to the top. Is there a way that we can turn the corner where countries are not suspiciously looking at each other and then begrudgingly putting down their target, but really are trying to compete with each other to do that? And to make a long story short, the breakthrough was the US-China announcement in November of 2014, a full year before the Paris Climate Summit. And so it had been agreed to earlier that countries should come out early with their targets well before Paris. And historically speaking, the US and China have always been at odds in this process. I mean, they've really been the two biggest adversaries in the climate process. But they're also the two biggest emitters, you know. You can't get a workable climate deal unless these two countries are doing a lot, and you want them to do as much as possible. And what happened in November 2014 is a total shock to the world community. The US and China jointly announced their targets together. So the two biggest adversaries, sort of de facto the two biggest leaders of the two biggest blocs, developed versus developing countries, which has been the tension that's really been difficult to overcome, announced together. And they announced together not only targets that are very robust and I think very good, but also they gave each other the imprimatur, right, of their assent to how good each other's targets were. And this was a signal. And it laid down a challenge, right, to other countries to step up and also come out early and do a lot. It also did a lot it didn't do everything, but it certainly laid the groundwork for overcoming these historical divisions before developed and developing countries, creating this race to the top and getting a more of a cooperative solution. And I was actually in the room when it was first, you know, suggested to the most senior climate negotiators in the State Department that the U.S. should work on the U.S. and China, you know, putting up, announcing their targets together that early. And the immediate reaction of many people in the room was, oh, no, 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 why would the Chinese ever do this? This is impossible. But it was possible, and it actually got the ball rolling towards getting the kind of early adoption and early ambition that we got out of Paris. Didn't settle everything, but it got it there. And then once we got there, because when, like I said before, when Paris started, we had 188 pledges already in. Then really what it was is then can we create an agreement that takes those pledges and creates this process, right, that is going to make parties do more, create better transparency to know what everyone's doing. And the ambition was focused on those kinds of rules and not on actually the content of the pledges. And that really helped quite a lot.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And it's wonderful that for once the United States is acting as a leader in ethical matters. Yeah. But it's called the Paris Agreement.
Yes.
And that signals something interesting about the nature of this commitment by the world community. It's not a treaty.
Right.
And what does that mean exactly? How did we come to an agreement, and what was the mechanism to get us to all agree that these are the targets that we will aim at?
Well, so this is a very interesting sort of part of this, not terribly well understood. Because we throw these words around like, there's agreements, there are treaties, there are protocols,
right.
there are like all these kinds of things out there in the international system. What's most important, I think, here is to realize that the treaty that we signed, that was signed by the United States, and in fact ratified unanimously by the U.S. Senate, which was Democratic controlled at the time in 1992, and also signed by a Republican president, the first George Bush, was the treaty that created the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Right. So that was the overall treaty that created the structure, and this is a kind of a common mechanism that's used in international governance in lots of ways. You create kind of an overall structure, then the structure spits out these particular agreements and protocols and things like this. So calling this the Paris Agreement rather than the Paris Treaty is a signal that this is an agreement under the original 1992 treaty. It's not a revision of it. It's consistent with all the principles that were laid out on it, which are very important in many countries around the world, especially the kind of the very basic language that you get there about burden sharing, for the balancing the responsibilities of rich versus poor countries, developed versus developing, those kinds of things. So it's really consistent with those principles. So it's an agreement under that. That's critical. But then also that it doesn't require, countries of the world to really sign on or ratify a brand new treaty. So that consistency is critically important, I think, to show the continuity between the two. It has binding and non-binding elements. The content of the pledges that countries made are non-binding, and that allows countries to have a lot more flexibility and negotiate with their, sometimes very difficult domestic environments on this issue for very different reasons in countries around the world. Climate policy, as we know, has been a difficult discussion in the United States historically. It's a difficult discussion in countries like India for very, very different reasons. And so the content of the pledges themselves are non-binding, but everything around them, the rules about verifying, what you're doing and reporting, and the rules about, the cycles of pledges that will happen in the future, that's all legally binding. The differences between those kind of don't matter so much, but what's most important, and this is the thing to get to, I think, the last part of your question is, countries didn't so much agree with each other on, there was no process where a bunch of countries said, countries A through Y said to country Z, this is what your target should be. Countries produce their own targets. And it took us a while to realize that that is the formula for getting countries to step up to the plate and actually do things much more ambitious than they'd ever done before, the Kyoto Protocol, any of those agreements that came before. You had to allow countries to set the pledges themselves. But there was pressure. And the pressure was much more kind of soft power, much more informal. There was the pressure of each country scrutinizing each other. I give you the example of the US and China. There are some parts of the Chinese overall pledge to Paris that were not announced in November 2014 because the US was not comfortable with China announcing those parts of its target there. We had to go through a long process of getting comfortable with sort of giving each other, right, this sense of approval of each other's targets. And then the other pressure is from the international community, from NGOs like everyone else, kind of being able to look at these targets early on and then come up with, there's tons of reports that came out ranking them and giving them grades and, color coding them green, yellow, red, and all kinds of things, sort of saying whether or not they thought countries were doing what was adequate, what was consistent with what their historical pollution has been, things like this. So it was a much more diffuse process, but I think altogether it actually worked, again, much better than we thought it would.
So before I ask you about the election cycle, and today happens to be the day when we're going to have the first presidential debate.
Yes.
Can you give us an example of some commitments that were made beyond and above what was agreed to in Paris that can serve as an exemplar of how certain nations are taking ethical leadership in climate change?
Yes, I will. So I'll give you one example of what was announced and one that actually might be announced in a few weeks, which was I think, tremendously exciting. So one that was announced in Paris, which I did a little bit of work on, was the creation of something called Mission Innovation. And though this was a commitment by the world's, the 20 countries in the world responsible for the biggest chunk of research and development in non-carbon, zero-carbon energy technologies. So includes the US and China and India, like all the big countries out there, the EU, And these 20 countries announced even before really, as negotiations were just beginning in Paris, that they agreed to double their research and development budgets on clean energy by 2020. And then they were joined by Bill Gates and a collection of some 25 to 30 billionaire investors, that they would create a special finance fund, an investment fund, to support those countries in not only achieving those targets, but actually helping to add more money to the pot so that you could go from research and development to eventual deployment. And so Gates came forward with $1 billion pledge, then others will come forward with more. And so altogether, you're going to get an enormous, unprecedented plus up in the amount of money available for non-carbon energy solutions, which is absolutely the key, right, for making the pledges work, than we've ever seen before. And that was completely outside of the negotiations in Paris. And it was not something that 190 countries had to agree to. It was a smaller club of countries. And we're seeing sort of more examples of that, like where you've got clubs of countries coming together to work on everything from climate smart agriculture to so-called short-lived climate pollutants like methane and black carbon, and just the list goes on, where we're sort of seeing processes like this. Now, in a few weeks, we're actually going to see, hopefully, the culmination of what has been an almost 6-7 year process to use an entirely different international treaty to do something very ambitious on climate change. And the treaty process is the Montreal Protocol, which has been called by Kofi Annan, right, the former Secretary General, as not just the most impactful and successful environmental treaty of all time, but the most successful treaty of any kind of all time. So this is the treaty we created, of course, to deal with the problem of the ozone layer. We've used it to phase out chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons and other ozone depleting substances. But one of the substitutes for all those ozone depleting substances has been to move to hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. Now, HFCs are a greenhouse gas. They don't deplete the ozone layer, but they are one of the most potent greenhouse gases in the world. Tens of thousands of times, in some cases, more powerful than CO2. But very short-lived, very short-lived. So if you can get rid of them, then you can get a very sort of what we call fast-acting mitigation. You can actually have a much stronger signal, and you can get sort of a release from some of that increasing in temperatures over time. So what are HFCs used for? Mostly refrigeration and cooling. There are abundant alternatives to HFCs out there, some proprietary, some non-proprietary. And so we've been pushing for years and years to amend the Montreal Protocol to phase down HFCs. We're this close to it. I think we're going to get it this year. If we do that, and we get a phase down of HFCs with an early freeze date in the early 2020s, we will avoid 0.5 degree of warming by the end of the century. Now again, overall goal that had been established was 2 degrees. We're already at 1. You can avoid half. That's a lot.
Yes.
That is huge. And this is completely outside the Framework Convention. The politics are not the same. It's, and it's being supported by these outside, smaller groups of countries, but also philanthropies. So just this past week at the UN General Assembly, a group of donor countries, including the US, and a bigger group of philanthropies, mostly based in the US, agreed to create an additional pot of $80 million to help developing countries in a phase out of HFCs to make it easier for them to do this. And that is actually a lot when you're just talking about these very kind of restricted sectors of refrigeration and air conditioning. And so there you got, like, again, something non-governmental actors supporting an overall action that could be tremendous for climate. And those kinds of things really actually are where I see that the action is moving forward. These kind of smaller groups of countries solving these problems and then showing the world that we can do this.
That's fantastic. So we know that the Obama White House, the Obama administration was instrumental key in getting us to Paris and behind the scenes orchestrating this, for instance, China-US pre-announcement to encourage people to come forward. We're about to elect a new president. These two candidates, you could say, are on opposite spectrums of the thinking about climate change and how governments could actually influence this. Let us entertain a scenario where Trump to be elected. Would this adversely affect the kinds of inroads we have made on climate policy? Or would Hillary Clinton to be elected, would she continue the Obama policies or perhaps even accelerate them or go up one more step?
Well, let me give you the answer first that I'm certain about.
Right.
It's very transparent. You look at the information on Hillary Clinton's campaign website, you look at her speeches during the campaign, going back through the primaries, look at the sort of the prominent statements by many of her spokespeople on these issues. Absolutely certain Hillary Clinton will continue the policies of the Obama administration, both domestically and internationally, and has ambitious plans to expand them, especially in the solar sector, but many other areas. I think there's no doubt about that. Many of the people who are kind of leading the Hillary Clinton campaign on climate change are people I'd worked for before in the Obama administration and in NGOs, and so there's no doubt about that. And it's the plans that they have are impressive. I'll just mention one thing I think is really important, especially we're in central Pennsylvania, is the first policy that was announced, policy paper that was done out of the Clinton campaign, as far as I know, on climate change, happened very early on, was a program of basically a works retraining program for coal miners, for people in coal country. And this is essential, I mean, without anything to do with the Paris and other things or other forces, the unexpected explosion in the natural gas sector, like all sorts of things are sort of driving, coal companies sort of to increasingly smaller parts of the energy market and coal-fired power plants. And the absolutely essential regulations that were done by the Obama administration in the face of a Congress that was not willing to move and act on creating national climate legislation. So the Obama administration moved to create a set of rules under the Clean Air Act to begin to, it's called collectively the Clean Power Plan, to begin to move away from fossil fuels and get the U.S. on a sustainable energy future in non-carbon sources, which is the basis of our pledge for Paris. So our pledges we made for Paris are really built, not exclusively, but in large part around those kinds of regulations, which I'll come back to in a second. But what was critical is that the Clinton campaign focused first on retraining coal miners, absolutely essential. And this is one of the most toxic, slogans or whatever that you want to call them in coming up with a coherent and rational policy on climate change in the US is that it amounts to a war on coal. And that's terrible. It's politically divisive. I think it's misleading. It's all these other things. You got to take care of that, though, if you're really ever going to move to, again, trying to come up with a national price on carbon, which is going to be absolutely essential to move beyond our 2025 pledges that we made in Paris to do more to get where we need to be by, say, 2050. And so I think that shows not only a seriousness about the problem on the Clinton, in terms of the Clinton campaign and the candidate herself, but also a seriousness about the kind of coming together of the country that really needs to happen in order to make this transition. So that's critical. Now, Donald Trump, much harder to sort of say. There's a difference between campaigning and governing. If we just look at what he said in the campaign, looks terrible. Donald Trump has said that he would renegotiate the Paris Agreement. He had variously said in the past that climate change was a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese. He has, campaigned very strong towards the traditional fossil fuel industries to support him. I mean, there are many sort of reasons to believe that this is either something he's going to work to dismantle the Clean Power Plan and everything we did, which sort of was an absolutely essential part of getting the Paris Agreement because it showed the U.S. was serious about reducing its emissions in the future, or we just kind of don't know where it would lie, right, on his priorities when he comes in. Were he to be elected, one thing to be sure is he can't just renegotiate the Paris Agreement because he wants to. And one of my former bosses, Todd Stern, person I primarily worked for in the State Department, the former special envoy on climate change, wrote a great op-ed in the Washington Post, sort of said, effectively, like Donald Trump says he's going to renegotiate Paris. He can't do that. I know because I negotiated the treaty, right? And Todd goes through and he's very carefully kind of lays out the case there, but you can't obviously just force 190 plus countries to come back to the table and open up the books and do it all over again. Now, if Trump were to come in and start dismantling the Clean Power Plan, and were successful doing it, then there would be a huge international backlash. Right. And it would definitely start to dismantle, the work that we did for Paris around the world. There are, leaders in other major powers around the world who put their, put down very strong political markers on the U.S. finally, right, being on board to do something ambitious on this problem. And that was part of their political capital. They spent that capital to get their countries to go along with the Paris Agreement. If the United States were to, stop participating, dismantle its domestic regulations, or worse, then it's going to hurt those people in their countries, and that will make it even harder for us to maintain the coalition that got Paris. Now, the part of this that adds to the uncertainty, though, is that it will be difficult for Donald Trump or any other president to completely dismantle what has been accomplished by the Obama administration directly. The Clean Power Plan is not an executive order. It's a regulation under a law that was passed by the United States Congress and signed by the previous president. And so this would have to be very high on the priority list of any new president to dismantle that domestic legislation and try to roll that back. Let me say one other thing that I think is really critical for people to understand in this. First of all, the Paris Agreement, which was negotiated, by consensus in December 2015, many countries came to the U.S. in April 2016 to the UN and signed the agreement. And now we're about to reach the point where the agreement enters into force. And so this is a technical term in sort of diplomatic circles. When an agreement or treaty or protocol enters into force, that means it's out there, it's binding, it's now been agreed to, and the process has started. It's a real thing. It exists, and you can't walk back from it, right? So we are again inches away from the goal line of the Paris Agreement entering into force. This is astounding. I'm told this is the fastest entry into force of any international agreement ever, and this is amazing. So the threshold in the Paris Agreement was at least 55 countries need to, join the agreement, officially join using whatever domestic processes they have to join these kinds of, these kinds of agreements. And those 55 countries must represent at least 55% of global emissions. Very similar to the formula we had for the Kyoto Protocol. It was just announced that India is going to join the Paris Agreement on Gandhi's birthday, which I believe is October 3rd, so just around the corner. And from last week, we knew we already had more than 55 countries. We had over 60 who had joined the Paris Agreement, including the United States and China. Many other countries had joined the Paris Agreement. And if you take those countries and the ones who said, we're really close to it, it'll happen very quickly, we just got to have our legislature meet and kind of finish the job, we were very close to that 55% threshold, not quite there. But with India announcing we'll be over the threshold, which means the Paris Agreement, the U.S. is in the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is there. It's done before the next election, before the next inauguration. Now the Paris Agreement, very interestingly, it takes a country a full 4 years to pull out. So if there's a president who wants to walk away from the Paris Agreement, it legally will take them now 4 years to physically leave the Paris Agreement. You can do the math of what else takes 4 years. And does that mean that, a Trump administration could not send people to the meetings of the Framework Convention? Sure, they could. They could do things like that. But hopefully that will create the space where really a Trump administration could figure out, well, what would be the consequences of leaving the Paris Agreement? Because it won't just be consequences on climate. It'll be consequences on international diplomacy, writ large. Climate change is no longer the siloed issue. It is now approaching, not quite there yet, but approaching the seriousness and the high level of international diplomacy on security and trade, and general economic issues. And what that means is that it's now part of what we think of as, the measure of whether or not you as a country are a good international actor or a bad international actor. And that also then becomes a measure of whether or not we want to cooperate with you on the other things you want to do. So any president, I think that the stakes will be extremely high for any president who wants to pull out of Paris. And then domestically, if you try to dismantle the Clean Power Plan, there obviously are going to be lots and lots of people in the United States who are going to oppose that, not just NGOs, but equally, if not more importantly, the abundant members of the private sector, firms that now are making money on the clean energy economy. And they will fight that. So it's not a fait accompli that, a President Trump snaps his fingers and it's all over.
Right. Would you say, maybe this is too dramatic, but this election is also a referendum on the United States leadership in climate change? It sounds that Trump is totally against the science and our leadership in international diplomacy. So were he to come in a sense, that would be sort of a turnaround of the United States leadership.
If Donald Trump or any president were to come in, reverse us on our domestic regulations that have gotten us where we are, and our plans for the future, very strongly set by the Obama administration, and were to walk away from this leadership position that we've shown to get the Paris Agreement, dramatic reversal. Yeah. I mean, a huge reversal. It'd be, it's sort of like going from a big cooperative international actor to isolationism overnight. And of course there'll be reverberations and there'll be consequences of that. And the question is, will the international community keep the process going until the United States were to, again, reprioritize itself on those issues?
So we have been talking a lot about policy and your intervention and your contribution to the United States taking a leading role in this very important issue for us. But you're also a philosopher and you're an ethicist.
Yes.
In your participation in the Paris Agreement, what was a striking ethical issue that you saw how thinking about ethics in a global context, in a contemporary context, can have an impact on policy? What was a particular ethical conundrum, challenge that we face?
I think one thing is that the whole thing, all of climate change is a moral problem, is one of the biggest, most difficult kind of moral challenges that we've all faced. So I think that the fact that there aren't more people who are ethicists who kind of work in the negotiations themselves is really more of an artifact of what we train people to do in grad school and more than anything else, there should be more room, right, for that. And, President Obama, Prime Minister Modi, Secretary Kerry, like leaders around the world have sort of echoed this sentiment. When you look at the actual text of an agreement, like Paris, there are references to obligations to the future, there's references to human rights in the preambular sections, there are kind of other places where explicit moral language shows up. But essentially, the fundamental question is really kind of the issue of distributive justice. And that is, what countries are to reduce their emissions by how much, in what time frame, based on what they've emitted before. As I mentioned before, the Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992 gives very vague language on this. it's embodied in this particular phrase now called common but differentiated responsibilities. Everyone has a responsibility to do something on climate change, but the responsibilities are differentiated because of different things. And so so that really is, I think, is like that's the kind of the fundamental thing. There's not a formula that was created to get the Paris Agreement, but it was more a kind of everyone kind of looking around and going, all right, we think these pledges and the greater ambition, right, of expressed by developed countries, over developing countries writ large, was enough to get countries to agree to the Paris Agreement. There were people who tried to do kind of these more fine-grained analyses of the adequacy of each pledge, which I think has varying degrees of impactfulness or utility in these negotiations, but essentially it was a kind of a very rough assessment of that. There were particular issues that popped up that I think we will continue to see we'll continue to see ethical issues kind of rise more to the fore. The one that I focused the most on is this issue of loss and damage. So this was a part of the agreement that kind of goes back a number of years. It was relatively new in the world of climate diplomacy, where traditionally we see a climate agreement has kind of three parts: mitigation, adaptation, and finance. Finance being the money that donor countries give to recipient countries to help them reduce their emissions faster and adapt to climate change. In different parts of those, there's like always now sections on land use and forestry and things like that. But those are the three biggest pillars. And so there was a claim made a number of years ago, mostly by small island states, that we should add a new pillar called loss and damage, really to deal with those impacts of climate change, either slow onset events or emergency events that you can't adapt to, especially if you're a small island state, right? And don't have a lot of resources. So these are things like sea level rise, which we might be able to, adapt to coastal parts of the United States to some degree of effectiveness, but there's some parts of the world where, they will just lose sovereign territory completely because of this. And that really became, an issue that exerted a tremendous amount of influence over the negotiations and really empowered the small island states in a way that they had never been before, because it really was a very strong claim that was generally a moral claim about responsibility of countries to turn and assist them for this, and maybe even think about things like changing the overall target for what climate stabilization should be from 2 degrees to 1.5, to very particular claims that some parties brought forward on things like whether or not we need a mechanism for liability and compensation for losses due to climate change. That was successfully resolved in Paris, so we don't have a liability and compensation mechanism coming out of Paris, and I think that was probably good. They found more creative ways to deal with the claims and the needs of small island states on this. Again, mostly negotiated outside of the negotiations themselves and created outside the negotiations. But there we kind of do see like these really tricky questions. And I think that probably the most important thing that I could bring to the table, with my philosophical background as opposed to my policy background, was really pluralism, frankly. Because you've got 194 countries negotiating an agreement operating by consensus.
May I ask, when you say pluralism, do you mean moral pluralism or?
Moral pluralism, yeah. So in the sense, in a very basic sense, but important. So in the sense of, you've got 194 countries coming together. It's a consensus process. Everybody has a veto. You have got to have a very deep appreciation for the moral frame in which very different countries come to this question and think about who should do more, how much is owed, like all those kinds of things that actually make a climate agreement real. Yeah. And so you can't just come in and kind of go, look, I've got this predetermined sense of what the right outcome should be based on my formula for distributive justice. That doesn't work, because you're not going to get that kind of an agreement around like a fairly narrow notion of that, no matter how ideal the outcome would be. So you've got to be really be able to deeply understand the reasons why different countries take the positions that they do, appreciate those, and then try to find the common ground where you can at least pragmatically be able to set aside certain things and agree to enough so that you can get an agreement. And I think that especially in the work that I did on India, because I was the India lead for the Special Envoy's Office on Climate Change, I did a lot of very technical work, helping to build programs and work with other US agencies to do work on renewable energy, all kinds of things. But I think if there was anything that I brought to the table that was kind of more explicitly from my philosophical background, is helping the US negotiators understand where the Indians were coming from. Yeah. And not only in the sense of, the common refrain you hear in India, which is, you rich countries, you caused this problem, we didn't, we've got development needs which are overwhelming, you can't tell us what to do in our electricity sector or whatever, but really more appreciating, for example, and I believe this, that Prime Minister Modi thinks about climate change in a completely moral lens. I mean, Prime Minister Modi, when he was the chief minister of the state of Gujarat, which is governor of Gujarat, effectively, wrote a book on climate change, which is called Convenient Action. And it was a response to Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. Yeah. And Modi was way ahead of the game in India on building out, especially the solar sector, also creating the first Department of Climate Change in a government in India, takes the problem very seriously. And you look at his book, Convenient Action, and he says very explicitly that he thinks that we all have a responsibility to do something on climate change, and his approach to it, it is grounded in sacred Hindu texts. So it's a moral obligation to do something on climate change grounded in his spiritual background. Mm-hmm. And I believe that President Obama, has a very similar fundamental sense of why we need to do something on climate change. It's about obligations to the future. It's very personal to him. And there's a strong sense in which these two leaders who look at this question in very different ways, have very different difficulties in their respective domestic environments on how to deal with climate change, what should we be doing internationally, how much should we be doing internationally. They agreed fundamentally on the same moral framework. Again, very broad brushstrokes, but that is the kind of thing that I think where these two leaders can recognize in each other is part of the raw material that makes something like the Paris Agreement possible.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your presentation later on today. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo.